thanks for coming to our little celebration the other day. I appreciated that, man.
Man, that was the highlight of my year.
Oh.
And David McLean, the geographic photographer who you met,
he was great.
He was just blown away. He talked about it for 2 days. He comes from rural Maine, and to all of a sudden be vectored into the rich rural world of sublime hipness. It was.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that, but I mean, I was fascinated by his story. I mean, I can't imagine, first of all, the path towards becoming a National Geographic photographer. I mean, you got to be the dude, right? I mean, that is like the cream of the crop when it comes to nature and culture photography. You know, there's got to be an amazing story there. And I would imagine he's sort of following you around now. He traveled with you, obviously, but now he's still kind of documenting what you're doing.
Well, we're doing a book together on the recipes. If you want to know what a 100-year-old ate to live to 100, you have to know what they ate their whole life. So we're trying to get recipes that are pre-1970, because after 1970, the American food culture hit these blue zones like Hurricane Irma and just destroyed. It's destroying them, and places are becoming rife with diabetes and cancer and the same things that Americans are suffering. So we try together. We're capturing not only the recipes but the images. So the resulting book is going to look like a hybrid between a cookbook and a National Geographic article.
That's pretty cool. And did you work with him on all the Blue Zone stuff, like dating back?
Yes, David shot the first Blue Zones cover story in 2005, and he and I. We were just hardcore explorers for about almost a decade before that, before we worked our way up to National Geographic. We biked across China together, and we did these quests to unravel the mysteries of the collapse of the ancient Maya civilization. And then we really kind of, just like, like a band has to practice for 10,000 hours before they're good, we practiced for a decade, 10 years before we got good enough.
And now you have your groove.
Yeah, and he's doing his thing and I'm doing mine, but I hire him to come back to do things. And he's so hard, he's almost impossible to get him. And my past with him gives me access.
Lures him back in.
Yeah, and we have fun. We don't crush it. We don't work 16 hours a day like we used to. We knock off at happy hour.
Right.
Yeah.
Good, man. Well, you have a good quality of life, man. You're walking the talk. Like, you're actually living the principles that you've learned as a result of this crazy journey that you've been on, and it's nice to see.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. It's you immerse yourself in these places, and you can't help but be influenced and somehow bettered by them.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last time we sat down and did this, I think it was like 3 years ago. It was a while ago. At least 2 years ago.
2 years ago, I think.
There's a lot of new listeners since then, and everybody should go back and I don't know what episode number it was, but I'll put a link up into the show notes to the first time that we did the podcast. But it might be worth just kind of at least, establishing, who you are and the work that you've done with respect to the Blue Zones to create a little context for, the happiness stuff that we're going to get into.
Yeah, so I'm a lifelong explorer. I set 3 world records for biking, Alaska to Argentina, around the world and across Africa. Spent 8 years of my life, and then these series of expeditions that sought to unravel ancient mysteries. And then on an assignment for National Geographic and funding from the National Institutes on Aging, about 14 years ago, we set out to reverse engineer longevity. So instead of relying on Petri dish studies or university epidemiology studies, we worked with demographers whose expertise is finding geographic areas where people live verifiably the longest. And once you find these populations, and what that really means is they're avoiding the diseases that are killing us, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, chronic diseases. And then using established methodologies, we reverse engineered the longevity, what these people do to make it to 100. And we found common denominators in all 5 of these Blue Zones longevity hotspots. And the resulting articles and books. And now we have entire cities in America emulating these Blue Zones. And that's been a big focus and passion of mine for...
Yeah, because I think it's one thing to kind of I mean, first of all, you're not just going and interviewing a few people. Like, you really did apply like the scientific method to population studies, and you had this like, you know, well-honed, well-established set of criteria by which to evaluate all of these parameters to arrive at the conclusions that you did. And it revealed these certain truths and commonalities amongst these cultures. And it's one thing to kind of understand that. And it's another thing to try to figure out, okay, well, what do we do with this? How are we going to apply this to better our own lives? And what's really great and cool about your work is that that's what you've done. You've created this program where you go to these cities and you basically, like at the highest levels of government and planning, right? Like, you're meeting with people and trying to configure a way to literally and systemically change urban planning and the sort of allocation of dollars to funnel in the right direction to promote these habits that are conducive to longevity and optimal health. So, you know, tell me a little bit about that. You were in Kauai. From Instagram, it looked like you spent some time in Kauai.
Yes.
Is that the most recent one that you worked on?
Well, right now we have the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Hawaii has hired us to Blue Zone, the Big Island of Hawaii, much of Maui.
Oh, Big Island, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and much of Oahu. But just to go back to your earlier comment, I want to make a point. The way most people would cover longevity or centenarians is they find a centenarian and they ask the centenarian what they ate and how they slept and what their habits. And, you know, you find these kind of silly articles about the 100-year-old who ate 3 eggs a day and smoked cigars and drank liquor and had a 6-year-old
Everybody
girlfriend.
loves those stories.
Yeah. But they're hugely misleading, because a centenarian no more knows how he or she got to live to 100 than a tall man knows how he got to be tall. The right way to do it is you have to find a population that has achieved either highest centenarian rate, highest life expectancy, or lowest rate of middle-age mortality. Once you identify the population, then you can find out what this whole group of people do, because they're, you know, about 20% of how long you live is dictated by your genes. The other 80% is lifestyle and environment. So if you find a centenarian, it might just be because he or she won the genetic lottery and they can abuse their body for 100 years and still make it to 105. But that doesn't mean they have any useful lessons for us. If you want useful lessons, you have to find whole verified population and reverse engineer. And the big aha, Rich, the big epiphany after almost a decade was places where people are making it to 100 and still water skiing or standing on their head or doing karate. It's not because they tried. It's not because at age 50 they got on a special diet or started taking a supplement or started running marathons. In all cases, longevity happened to these people. It was a residue of the right environment, an environment that nudges them into doing the right things all day long. And with that insight, we went about creating a program that would help entire American cities live longer, not by trying to convince 800,000 people to change their habits and eat their veggies and get their exercise, but rather by shaping their environment so they're mindlessly and relentlessly nudged into doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing.
Right. So healthy lifestyle is a byproduct of the environment, not a byproduct of conscious decision making. It's an extrapolation of what's available to you at arm's length. It's the convenient choice as opposed to the more difficult or more expensive choice.
That's right. So you have Herculean discipline. I mean, these ultra marathons that you do that inspire so many people, they are for sure a positive force. But most people, if you look at the research, who start off and start running marathons, they're no longer running marathons in 2 years. People who start off on a diet, no matter how much resolve they have on day one, 90% of them are off of them by the 7th month.
And what do you, before we move off this point, like what do you make of that? Like what do you extract from that simple fact that people have trouble sort of staying on point?
Our minds are hardwired for novelty. So we crave new things. Our attention can last only so long. Discipline is a muscle, and muscles fatigue. And eventually you kind of revert to the mean of what you're doing, or the baseline of what you're doing. So if you want that baseline, if you want people to perform better, eat better, move better, socialize better, have more purpose, you need to raise the baseline. You need to optimize the environment, which is exactly what we set out to do.
And so when you go into these cities or you go to Hawaii, what are the talking points? Like, how do you shift that paradigm?
First of all, the cities have to want us. So instead of we don't have a sales force. Cities come to us all the time and we say, if you're sick of seeing 70% of your population overweight and unhealthy, we have a solution, but you have to prove to us, A, you're ready for it, sort of politically. B, you have to show us your leadership works well together. And C, we have to collectively figure out a way to pay for it. Because the only way you make these changes is if I can put a full-time staff in there from 3 to 5 years.
I would imagine it requires the political will to invest in the long term, right? Because it's not about the next election cycle with whoever is mayor or governor or what have you. Like, they have to think, what is in the best interest of our electorate, of our population? And it's a solution that's not going to manifest itself overnight or in the next 2 years, perhaps even. It's going to require, probably a large investment of capital and a long-term vision to, raise that mean for everybody so that eventually everybody prospers. But it's not like a clickbaity kind of immediate solution to what ails a particular urban environment.
It's focusing on permanent or semi-permanent changes to the environment. And it also requires the political will. America, we have this obsession with freedom. And in order to be successful, we have to come into a city where they're prepared to limit our freedoms to do unhealthy shit. That's the kind of the bottom line. I wouldn't put it that way to them. But at the end of the day, we're trying to limit their access to junk food. We're trying to limit their access to always getting in cars. We're trying to limit the occasion where they're going to implode into their devices. So in every city, I have 3 teams, 3 squads, full time. One squad just works with city council to adopt food policies that favor fruits and vegetables over junk food, that works with the built environment city planner to design their cities for humans, not just cars. You can raise the physical activity level of the whole city by 30% by just making parks accessible, providing bike lanes, providing bus, public transportation, provide means to walk places, to limit sprawl. And then lastly, we have an alcohol policy bundle, which brings in the evidence-based best practices to limit access to alcohol. Not cut it off altogether. The second squad goes to every restaurant, grocery store, workplace, and school with a Blue Zone certification program, which makes those environments 20% healthier. And we recognize them and drive traffic to them. And the third squad works with individuals to help individuals optimize their home so their kitchens aren't as accessible to junk food, to optimize their social networks so they're making 3 or 4 new friends who are plant-based eaters and who recreate with physical activity, and then to know their sense of purpose and put it to work by volunteering. So when you bring all 3 of those together, you create the perfect storm with enough intensity, 3 to 5 years. In every single city, we see obesity dropping down and happiness going up.
Wow. And so when these, 3 infantry teams, paratroop down into these cities and, occupy the territory, like, how long does that take? Like, how long do they stay there? What's the, what is the kind of arc of that gestation cycle?
So when you think of, Fort Worth, Texas is our biggest. Bizarrely enough, we work mostly in very conservative areas and I can't explain why, but we've been very successful. So in Fort Worth, there are 200 schools. There are about 1,000 different restaurants. So our team, we have a team of 30 people. They have to hit every one of those restaurants and schools and grocery stores and workplaces.
There's literally going door to door.
Yeah, they make appointments and they have to sit down and explain why to do this. With policy, the way our policy works is we come in with these. We don't tell people what to do. We don't tell city council you have to do this or you're not going to be certified Blue Zone. But we do show them a menu with 30 evidence-based policies that make their city healthier either from a food point of view or a built environment point of view. We bring all the leaders together, help them arrive at consensus of what would be effective and feasible here. And then our team works with city government to adopt these policies and implement them. And that usually takes 3 to 5 years. But when you get them in there, they're in there forever. Right. If we get them to increase the walkability by 30%, those sidewalks are there for half a century. So unlike trying to convince somebody to join a gym or start a CrossFit regimen, which is going to run out of gas in a year, this lasts for decades.
So is Fort Worth the biggest success story or just the largest urban environment?
It's the largest. The biggest
tackled?
Success story is right here in California, the beach cities of Redondo, Hermosa, and Manhattan Beach. And in the 5 years we worked there, we just got the Gallup data. The average BMI of the entire city dropped by 14%.
Wow.
And you start saying, what does that mean? That means there are 1,900 fewer obese people there than when we started. The obesity rate among children has dropped by about 50%. And they've saved $50 to $60 million in projected healthcare costs because of lower rates of diabetes and obesity. So it was a hugely great investment.
That's amazing. So give me an example of something that changed there. Like were there like bike paths that were built, or were there menu items changed at restaurants, or school lunch altered, or how did that play out?
So we were instrumental in putting in about 220 more miles of bike path, and LA is a place where people are obsessed with their cars. We were instrumental in connecting Palos Verdes with the rest of the beach cities, so you can bicycle all the way up and down. We're instrumental in getting an active living policy in place so that now every new streets are rebuilt every 5 to 7 years, has to be planned with a bike lane, trees, and a sidewalk in mind. So that starts to shift the paradigm from the car to people being on their feet. When we started, absolutely no kids walked to school. Now about 40% of all elementary schools have these walking school buses where they walk with an adult, so the kids and the adults are walking. School lunches have changed. We've prioritized vegetables, so when you go through the lunch line, the first food kids sees are vegetables. They're more likely to take it and eat it than when you put it at the end.
Right. That's a huge win. I would think tackling the school lunch thing is tough. There's a lot of money involved and contracts that, are very rich for the people that benefit from landing them, the food providers.
Well, here's the great untold secret. The USDA provides most of the funding for school lunches. Most public schools cannot afford school lunches without USDA money. If you take the USDA money, you have to buy USDA foods, which ends up being meats and cheeses and milks. I mean, there's some, vegetables, but there's kind of a catch-22. And there's also not money to hire cooks like before the Reagan era. The only money available for schools are very low-paid employees in the kitchen who just warm things. So you get a lot of like pizza pockets and pizzas and crap. But actually, there's one policy that is even more powerful when it comes to what your kids eat at school, and that's whether or not kids can eat in hallways and classrooms. So spending zero money, if a school says no eating in classrooms and hallways, the BMI of that school drops by about 11% over the course of a year.
That's interesting.
And that's just because if they can't eat in classrooms and hallways, they're not eating chips and sodas and candy.
And getting rid of vending machines, is that part of it too?
That's part of it. So once again, to be a Blue Zone certified school, we come with a menu, and it has 20 different things, about 20 things a school can do to improve the health environment of that school. Other things are, there's often snack carts after school. You can make sure there's only healthy choices on that snack cart. In vending machines, not necessarily taking them out, but only including water in them and healthy snacks. In Redondo Beach, they created a 1,000-foot radius around the school where no junk food vendors could come after school.
Oh, wow.
We've even had Spencer, Iowa, one of our Blue Zone cities, its city council, very conservative place. They had the courage to say no to a convenience store that was about to open up very close to the school, because that convenience store opens up, what are the kids eating after school? Mm-hmm. If they're skipping lunch and running across the street to the convenience store, what are they eating? So by taking that, by zoning it so they don't have access to that convenience store, you just improve the eating environment. Kids have to stay and eat a lunchroom.
It's so interesting that it's these conservative communities, because you would think these are the government bodies that are saying, we want less regulation. We don't want government telling us what to do and all of that. So that's fascinating.
But you have that juxtaposed with people with, for the most part, with great family values.
Right.
They
That's
care
true.
about their kids and they care about their community. It doesn't matter if you're left or right, but sometimes I sense in our conservative communities there's a stronger sense of civic. We're going to get this done.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
So it surprised me. I thought this was going to be a project for the San Franciscos of the country, but it turned out it's the Fort Worth and the Iowas and the Naples, Florida, all very conservative places, and it is going gangbusters.
It's got to be incredibly gratifying to translate, this work that you've done into a very real context where it's having a macro effect in an incredibly substantial way on vast numbers of people. It's not just like, I did this research, I found these conclusions, I wrote a book about it, and here you go. You're actually shifting not only the way people think about these things, but their behavior in the way that it's influenced by the very habitat in which they live. It's crazy.
They're two very different. Yes, you're right. It's very satisfying. The first book, The Blue Zones, identified the 9 common denominators in the longest lived people. So that's what you can do to live to 100. But the how is a very different animal. And I very consciously went about trying to find, how do you get people to adopt these habits long enough so they can avoid a chronic disease? So you have to not do the wrong thing for long enough to live a long time.
Right.
So that's
it's less about it's more focused on avoiding the wrong thing than doing the right thing.
It really is, because that's what that's what kills us at the end, I think. But it was a completely different science. And National Geographic, bless its heart, my home, they gave me a grant to look at communities that were unhealthy and got healthier. So not blue zones, as it were, but just places. 1972, North Karelia, Finland, had the highest rate of cardiovascular disease in the world. And miraculously, and this is the only place in the world, they were able to reduce the incidence of cardiovascular mortality in men by 80%, stomach cancer by about 60%. And they held it for 30 years.
I think we talked about this last time, but remind me what they were doing before and what the change was.
This was 140,000 people who were mostly dairy farmers. They fried their cheese in butter. And an epidemiologist by the name of Pekka Puska came in and did everything that most public health people have done for years. They promoted these fun runs and eat your veggie campaigns and health messaging. And he burned through his entire budget in 5 years. And he got this idea, actually. They're the mothership of what we do. They got the idea of changing the environment. And they did things. They realized that people love their sausage there. And they weren't going to convince 140,000 people not to eat sausage. Ain't going to happen. But they went to the sausage maker and convinced the sausage maker to replace 30% of the fat with mushrooms and to take out 30% of the sodium. And people in North Karelia weren't used to eating fruits because they were expensive and they weren't accessible. And Pekapushka convinced dairy farmers to take part of their land and grow berries, and then created a market for those berries so that all of a sudden berries were accessible and you could buy them year round. So people started eating more of them. So it was a change in the environment.
Right. Interesting. That's super cool, man. So in the course of doing, rolling up your sleeves and doing this Blue Zones work and traveling the world and meeting with all of these people, one aspect of this Blue Zones equation is life satisfaction, and packed into that is happiness. And the idea that, happiness and health are not mutually exclusive ideas, that these are very much, integrated. They're part and parcel of each other. So in many ways, I sort of think about this new, sort of tangent that you're on, not tangent, but this,
companion.
Extrapolation of the work that you've been doing, venturing directly into the world of happiness is really just an extension of work that you've been doing all along, but kind of more focused in one particular arena. Is that accurate?
Yes. So first of all, it's not worth living to 100 if you're miserable. So
right. You're probably not going to live to 100 if you are anyway, right? According to your work, at least.
Exactly. But also it turns out in America, if you're in the top quintile of the happiest people, you live about 8 years longer than if you're in the lowest quintile. So working on getting happier is almost as powerful as dropping a smoking habit when it comes to life expectancy. And I sort of developed, I think, this way of identifying the people who do it the best, evidence-based, and then reverse engineering it. So with Blue Zones, first Blue Zones, it was longest lived people, and now with happiness, we found the statistically happiest people in the world, and then reverse engineered what exactly they did to get so happy.
Right. So before we dig into that, let's define happiness, and then secondarily, perhaps you can talk a little bit about how you came up with a quantitative method for evaluating this on a community-wide basis.
So happiness is, academically speaking, a meaningless term. And I think I reveal this in the book in a way you probably haven't seen before, but sort of simplify it, happiness is an amalgam of how you experience your life day to day, how much joy you get out of every day. Number two, how you evaluate your life, what you think of yourself, how proud you are of what you've done, and how you've lived up to the expectations around you. And number three, purpose, feeling like you're living out your values. And it turns out that all three of those facets of happiness are measurable. They're measurable on an international level, and indeed Gallup and the World Database of Happiness measure all three of those kinds of happiness in 151 countries worldwide. And I was able to connect with them, thanks to National Geographic, and get their statisticians to tell me where are people experiencing those three kinds of happiness at the highest level, and then go there and try to explain what they're doing to achieve those kinds of happiness.
Right. And in so doing, there's some overlap with the Blue Zones, right? But there are also distinct regions that live sort of askew from the Blue Zones that you initially established.
Well, they're not the exact same place, but the original Blue Zones areas of longevity, they are within the top 10% of the happiest places in the world. There are places that are slightly happier, but they're also very healthy. Mm-hmm. So Singapore, for example, it's the happiest place in Asia as measured by life satisfaction and also absence of worry and stress. But they also have the second highest life expectancy in the world. So to the point you made at the very beginning here, that longevity and happiness go hand in hand.
Yeah, they're closely related. And the other thing that I think is interesting about evaluating happiness is that, once again, not a surprise to you, I'm sure, you find that the happiest people live in places where the environment is conducive to the factors that contribute to that happiness.
That's the bottom line.
Right.
It's just like there's all these studies that show that the harder you work to be happy, the less happy you are. And in a sense,
that's what we're all doing, though, right? You know?
Yeah, it's like Sisyphus, rolling the boulder up the hill and only to find it back down at the bottom the next day when you wake up. So positive psychology Marty Seligman and Sonia Lubomirsky, who lives right around here. They're great scientists, and they have identified techniques we can all do to get a little bit happier. And you've heard about them. Savoring, gratitude, meditation. They all kind of work, but they all kind of fall in the same category as diets, is they require a conscious behavior modification. You have to remember to do something every day, find time in your schedule, and have the discipline and presence of mind to do it. And that there is no evidence to show that any of those things work in the long term, because in order for them to work, you have to do them. They wear out. But there are dozens of things you can do to change your environment to make it more likely you'll be happy. So the Blue Zones of Happiness book is more about what you can do to design your surroundings to stack the deck in favor of happiness.
And I think we should unpack that and get into it. But let's run through a couple of the case studies, because I think it's super interesting when you talk about what it's like in Singapore and why they're happy, for example, based on the way that the city was conceptualized and planned in terms of how people live and the tax structure and how they, think about career, et cetera.
Yes. So, we love democracy, but often the problem with democracy, it amounts to a pooling of ignorance, and especially if people aren't getting the right education, and it's almost impossible for an American politician to make a long-term plan that extends beyond his or her own tenure. In Singapore, they were blessed, I would argue, with a great leader by the name of Lee Kuan Yew, a Cambridge-educated lawyer who came in 1965 under a difficult time. There was wars with the communists brewing at the time. But he was very smart. He was imbued with Confucian values of harmony, of honoring older people, of embracing security, and he was a big gardener as well. And he was also
hence the massive gardens.
Oh yeah. It's the second most densely populated place on Earth. It's 45 miles long, home to 5 million people, and there's greenery all around you and beautiful parks. Very smart use of the land. But he went about taking a data-backed approach to building a country that enabled these people to live out their values, Confucian values in this, not Judeo-Christians, which Americans tend to embrace, but these more Asian values. And he's done a spectacular job at it. Their economy has doubled 13 times since 1965. One of the highest GDPs in the world, highest life expectancies, and highest rates of life satisfaction in all of Asia.
Yeah, I thought it was really fascinating how you describe how they promote diversity in the way that people habitate and cohabitate, because most people live in these giant apartment buildings, right? And how the demographics of those buildings reflect the demographic of the city at whole, right? So there's no, this is where all the Jewish people live and this is where all the Puerto Ricans live or what have you, right? Everything is integrated.
Right. So Lee Kuan Yew inherited a diverse population. They're made up of Han Chinese, the Malay from Malaysian ethnicity, and Indians. That's most of who live there. Speak completely different languages, very different cultures, often at odds with each other. And he knew he was going to have a seething stew of conflict. And he did a few very smart things. First of all, he made English the lingua franca, so none of the other three ethnicities got to use their language. They brought in this fourth language. Every school reflects the ethnicity of the country. And Singapore, which is actually a country, it's sort of a city-state, has these subdivisions, so to speak, of about 250,000 people live in these high-rise. And every high-rise that contains Malay, Indian, and Chinese. And you go downstairs in the food courts, and they're all just these wonderful bazaars of these ethnic foods that reflect the people who live there. So
right, and talk about the tax structure. And is Singapore one of the places where the tax structure is implicated in kind of infusing the culture with a higher happiness quotient? Or
yes,
it's a couple other places that have
so that. They're brilliant, Singapore. So first of all, you see a correlation between places who take care of their elders and happiness. And Singapore spends more on its elders than any place else in Asia. And one of the things they very cleverly do, if you live within 100 meters of your aging parent, you get a tax break. That's because Lee Kuan Yew knows that given their values of elder veneration, you're going to take care of your parents if they live nearby.
Mm-hmm. And you're incentivized to do so.
Yes.
Which is such a foreign concept from our cultural point of view.
Of warehousing our parents in a retirement home. The other very clever thing they do, if you want to consume imported luxuries like Swiss chocolate or electronics or jewelry, there's a very high value-added tax. So it disincentivizes consumption. Consumption, by the way, the happiness value of it wears out very quickly. But the no matter who you are, no matter where you live in the world, in order to have happiness, you need food, shelter, health or health care, some education, some mobility, and you have to be able to treat yourself once in a while. So after that, the effect of money on happiness starts to wear out very quickly. Well, Lee Kuan Yew has made it very easy for everybody to have that minimum 5 or 6 things for happiness. Mm-hmm. And no matter if you are work at a food stand or sweep the streets or clean up public lavatories, as long as you make an effort to work, you're going to make enough money to cover your needs, those 5 or 6 things. They call it, instead of a welfare, it's called workfare. Mm-hmm. So they'll top up your wages so you get this minimum.
Right, and same thing in Denmark, right?
Denmark, it's
everybody
gets
national
paid the same,
right,
no matter what.
Right. You're like the lawyer and the postman.
You could sit on your couch,
amount.
Eat Doritos, and watch reruns of Leave It to Beaver, and you'll get that money.
Right, which is the antithesis of capitalism, and yet here we have a very happy population of people. And it's amazing because we all kind of intellectually know, like, all right, so if we can meet our needs and we can pay our bills and we have health care, then anything beyond that has a diminishing return in terms of our happiness quotient, right? And your work seems to prove this out. Yes.
Well, when it comes to money, yes, but there are other things you do.
Right. I'm talking about money. Sorry. I'm talking purely about money.
Yeah.
And this idea that, that money would be best spent saving to continue to alleviate the stress and anxiety that comes with the insecurity of not having enough. And also to be, channeled towards experiences, right?
Yeah. Well, let me interject a nuance here that's important. This is from Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton, both of whom won Nobel Prizes. So they're the ones that figured out that when it comes to money and how you experience your life, you don't get any more gratification or happiness after about $75,000 a year. But when it comes to how you evaluate your life satisfaction, the more money you make, the higher satisfaction is. So actually billionaires, they evaluate their lives better than millionaires. So it just depends what you're after.
Yeah, I guess. It's always been confusing to me that, after a certain point, a millionaire and a billionaire still, are propelling themselves forward to accumulate more and more and more. So obviously they are getting that kind of satisfaction out of it, although it's not changing the day-to-day quality of their life. In fact, it may be inhibiting it.
Exactly.
I mean, they would say otherwise, but
it's a little bit like, and I'm hoping this book kind of illuminates this, that, people want to know the secret to happiness. And I can't tell you the secret to happiness unless I know who you are. So there are people for whom measuring themselves against other people is a prime value. Mm-hmm. And for them, working to go from $1 million to $1 billion is a good investment for them. Most of us, I think you and me included, we're more interested in really savoring our lives, being present, experiencing it from day to day. It's important for us to feel proud of what we do and achieve financial security, but after that, we're not going to kill ourselves. But there are people who are. There are people that's their name of the game, and they can only be happy if they achieve some fanatic level of success.
Right. All right. So we talked about Singapore. We touched on Denmark. We have the Nicoya Peninsula once again, front and center, right?
Well,
in Costa Rica.
Close. It's actually Cartago, Costa Rica. So the blue zone area of longevity is Nicoya, which is on the coast. The happiest place actually is in the center of Costa Rica, in the Central Valley. It's a place called Cartago.
And similar to Singapore, it kind of started from the top down because the powers that be came from education backgrounds, right? They were teachers.
Yes. So I argue that if you have a happy place in the world, it never happens by chance. It's not just because they have a happy culture. You look at Costa Rica, very happy place. You look north in Nicaragua, it's a basket case, and south in Panama, it's a basket case, and they're both, Latin American cultures. But for some reason, Costa Rica is, by orders of magnitude, happier than Nicaragua to the north. And whether you look at Denmark, Singapore, Costa Rica, or I also profile Boulder, Colorado, all of these happy places have their roots in 4 or so policies. Enlightened leaders between 50 and 150 years ago shifted away from kind of blind economic growth and channeled resources into educating kids. And I'm not talking about PhDs. I'm talking about getting 98 or 99% of children literate. Educating women. Interestingly, Costa Rica and Denmark were 2 of the first countries on earth to educate the daughters of peasants, not the sons, the daughters. And why is that important? Because daughters grow up to be mothers. And when you have an educated mother, she tends to have fewer children. She tends to take care of her children better. They tend to make sure they get a better education. They grow up healthier, smarter. They get better jobs. They're more productive. They're healthier. They make better voting decisions. And it creates this upward ratcheting of happiness. Also, the emphasis in all happy places, there's a big investment in public health. And this is vastly different than the national conversation we're having now between Obamacare and whatever the Republicans are promoting. In this country,
which is unclear right now.
Yeah, but regardless of which one wins, it's the same flawed economic system. We incent for sickness. Nobody makes money in this country in health unless you get sick. Pharmaceutical companies make money when you get a prescription. Hospitals make money when you rent a bed, and doctors get paid for procedures.
And insurance companies.
And insurance companies in between. Doctors are great people, but they get paid the same whether they cure you or they kill you. In places where people are happy, the investment is put way upstream to help make sure you don't get sick in the first place. So Costa Rica, for example, I think is the best healthcare system in the world. Every man, woman, and child, this is a very poor country, by the way, has the right of 1 visit a year from a health professional. Somebody's going to come knock on your door, spend 30 minutes with you, no matter who you are, take your blood pressure, check you for diabetes, check you for depression. They're going to go in your backyard, look for standing water so that Zika doesn't breathe. They're going to go in your refrigerator and give you some advice about what should be in there and what should not be in there. And they're catching diseases like diabetes and heart disease decades before it's a 3-alarm fire. And it's that health, as we started off this conversation, that health and happiness, they go hand in hand. And Costa Rica has about half the rate of mortality, middle-aged mortality, that Americans do. 2.5 times better chance of reaching a healthy age 92. And they spend 1/15 the amount we do on healthcare.
Right.
So there's a lesson there that we should be listening to.
Yeah, I know. Well, the lessons that can be extrapolated from these various cultures are innumerable, right? And I think it goes back to political will, right? Like, what are the systemic changes that would have to occur in a country like the United States in order to begin implementing some of these policy shifts that are obviously, so positively beneficial?
So as part of this geographic project, we hired the top 10 economists and happiness experts in the world and did this Delphi procedure, which is a scientific consensus to get the best ideas together and to rank them for effectiveness and for feasibility. And we identified the 10 things that Americans or leaders anywhere should be doing if they really want a happier nation. And I think it starts with evidence-based, knowing what works and what doesn't work. What we think brings us happiness, both at a population level and an individual level, is misguided and often completely wrong. For example, growing GDP, that tends to be the yardstick of success of a country. That only works with poor countries. After you get to the GDP of Portugal, trying to raise GDP more has very little effect on how happy you are. But about 1/6 of any population in the world is suffering from some sort of mental illness, anxiety or depression. Those are the big ones, about 16% of the population. They drive about 50% of the unhappiness in any country. And it turns out you can resolve about 50% of the anxiety and depression cases with just 12 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy. So if America, this is going to sound weird, but this is what the evidence says. If America wanted to become significantly happier, the best investment we could make is make sure that everybody who's depressed and suffering from anxiety in this country got cognitive behavioral therapy. And by the way, those people with these mental illnesses, they drive about 50% of the use of social services. They drive about 50% of the crime, 50% of the absenteeism, and 50% of the hospitalization.
I would imagine pharmaceutical dependence as well. And,
yes,
extrapolating
exactly.
from that, drug addiction, which obviously leads back to crime and the privatizations of our prisons and the lack of investment or interest in really developing, treatment for these conditions. We're just warehousing these people, and we're just perpetrating that vicious cycle that leads to more crime and more disenfranchisement and more addiction, and it just goes on and on and on.
But yet we fail to see that. So if you have diabetes in this country, there's nearly a 100% chance you'll be treated for. Anybody can get treatment for diabetes in this country, and there's a huge pharmaceutical companies make a ton of money off of diabetes drugs. If you have depression or anxiety, there's only about a 15% chance you'll be treated in this country. It largely goes untreated because, there's no big sort of cognitive behavioral therapy lobby that's making sure that we're getting that kind of treatment here. It doesn't have the economic underpinnings that a pharmaceutical approach does. So.
Yeah, although there's a lot of, prescription medications getting doled out to deal with these things, but perhaps not enough focus on the cognitive therapy aspect of it.
Yes, and we know cognitive behavioral therapy works. If cognitive behavioral therapy were a drug, it'd be a blockbuster drug. It is 50% successful. There's good research behind that.
Wow, that's amazing. Tolerance is a big thing too, right? In these communities?
Yeah, at an international level. Essentially, you want to live in a place where you can feel free to live out the life that's right for you. So if you're a woman, you have the same rights as a man. If you're old, if you're gay, if you're transgender. So Denmark is one of the most tolerant places in the world. So essentially these findings start with a statistical basis. So these international surveys ask you how happy you are in a variety of different ways. And then they ask you 60 or 70 other questions about how you live your life. How much money you make? Are you married? Your religiosity? Are you doing new and interesting things every day? Do you feel healthy? Do you trust your neighbors? Do you feel like you can live out your values, etc.? And then there's a statistical process known as regression analysis, where you can find out what correlates with happiness, or what goes hand in hand with happiness. And the big six are trust. Can I trust my neighbor? Tolerance. Can I live out my values? Do I have really good social connections? Healthy life expectancy. GDP is one of them. And freedom. but not so much freedom to do anything, but freedom once again to do the work that's right for you. Those are the big correlates to happiness, no matter where you live.
And from that, you kind of drill down. Tell me if I'm misinterpreting this, but you drill down on these kind of 3 core ideas: pleasure, purpose, and pride, as kind of cofactors in your own analysis of your personal happiness quotient. Is that?
Well, all of these surveys measure life satisfaction, which is essentially pride, positive affect, which is how you've experienced in your life in the last 24 hours. I call that pleasure. And then purpose. Do new and interesting things every day. So those 3 P's are actually measured. I kind of simplified the academic terms. But we know, statistically speaking, where those 3 types of happiness excel the most.
And where does the United States fall on this spectrum of happiness?
We get like a B. I mean, given our GDP, given how wealthy we are, we should be doing a lot better. We're about 27th in the country, in the world.
And is there any one of these factors where we're well below what would be considered average?
Yes.
Like where's our weak spots?
So there's vast variations, and it's not really fair to talk about the U.S. because in the southeastern, the Appalachia, the Rust Belt, those places are very unhappy on all 3. But then you look to places like Boulder, Colorado, San Luis Obispo, Ogden, Utah, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Portland. Those places are world class when it comes to all 3. So it depends where you are in the United States.
And Boulder is one of the ones that you selected as the top, right? Among the top in the world?
So Dan Buettner's over at the senior scientist at Gallup, and I worked on an index that we tried to find the 15 what he calls cowbell measures of what really is happiness. What's the componentry of happiness? And we created a special index and applied it to 171 cities in America. And Boulder came out the top. Santa Cruz was very high up there. Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, Charleston, North Carolina was actually pretty high. Naples, Florida.
And these communities, what are the main things that they share in common beyond what we've already talked about?
They're walkable and bikeable, very high correlate. There's a healthy food environment. There was enlightened leadership that shifted the focus from just economic development to quality of life. Often building and developing and progress are mutually exclusive pursuits to creating a high quality of life. And most of these happy cities have said, we have enough, we've developed enough. Now let's preserve our natural environment and let's focus on building quality of life from both a policy point of view and a built environment point of view.
Bikes are a big part of this whole thing. Bikes and walking, right?
You look at the walk score, which you can go online and plug in your zip code, and it'll tell you the walk score. Walk score is probably the biggest predictor of how happy your city is.
Yeah.
Copenhagen's the most bikeable city on earth. It's also the happiest.
That's cool. I don't live in a walkable place.
Well, think about cars. So if you live on a street where cars are zipping by at 50 miles an hour, number one, you have that noise which creates stress. There's danger. There's pollution. And we know now that car pollution is associated with diabetes, dementia, and even kidney failure. You can't move and get exercise because you're at the bottom of the transportation food chain when you're on your feet. When you live in a place that's bikeable, it's quiet, you run into people, it's very easy to get to places to shop and places to worship and socialize. If America could see clearly, the best investment, I think, at an urban level would be making our cities more walkable and bikeable.
Hence, you're now living in Santa Barbara.
Mama didn't raise no fool.
I know. And you live in this region of the world without a car, which is not easy to do. Although Uber helps, I know.
I don't own a car. When I install in Santa Barbara, I never get in a car. I mean, I come back and forth to the airport or something on a car, but I get on my bike and go everywhere.
So I took the Blue Zone's 10-minute happiness quiz on your website.
True happiness test.
True happiness test, yes. And I proudly scored an A+, which I'm very happy about.
Attaboy.
Despite the fact that there's one question about how much time do you spend in a car, and I just slide that slider all the way over to the right, and I was like, this is going to fuck up my score. Because it's like, you know where these questions are going, right?
Yeah.
I was trying to be as honest as possible, but I was like, yeah, this is definitely going to put me down in the B- factor because I'm driving around all the time. But I think I compensated for it with, I think in large part, like a sense of purposefulness, like the ikigai that you talk about with Blue Zones, I think is very high in my life. And you know, diet and exercise, obviously movement and community. Like I make a practice of making sure that I take time for friends, which isn't always easy and isn't my default thing. But when I do, my life is happier and better.
Yeah, I had the privilege last Saturday to join you in your community, and you're very generous, and you're also a curator. You're one of these connectors. And one of the more dependable ways to get happier, no matter what kind of happiness, is improve your social equity, your social connections. And you are a master at putting interesting people together and sort of being at the center of it, not as a me, I want the attention, but supporting people from the outside. And you're a giver, to put it in Adam Grant's words.
Well, it was a pleasure and a delight to be able to host that thing. And Greg, my business partner, I have to give credit to him. He's the one who kind of, you know, orchestrated the whole thing. But it was great. And I think for me, it was beautiful not just to get all these people that I love so much in one room and so they could meet each other and all of that, but then to take everybody over to see InQ.
Oh my God.
And I know, like, you know, did you even know who InQ was?
No idea.
Right,
I was ready to roll my eyes.
Yeah, I mean, you guys were out of there. Like a lot of people were like, yeah, that's cool. I'm here for the party. I don't know about the InQ part. And I was like, no, you guys, you got to check this out. So I think your perspective was common. Like a lot of people were like, didn't really know what to expect or who he was. And he was it was kind of a beautiful gift to give to everyone else.
It really
so
was.
Like, he was so inspiring, and, you know, it's impossible to not, you know, sit there and listen to him and not leave, you know, feeling amazing.
I think he metabolized the human condition living in 2017 and helped us. We all feel exactly what he described, but he helped. First of all, he didn't put himself above us. He was among us. You know, he was talking about seeing his old therapist at his new therapist's
yeah, that was great. I know.
But
his old therapist in the waiting room coming out from his new therapist.
Yeah. Like, hey, but he helps us all make sense of this crazy journey we're on.
Yeah, he really does, in a very beautiful, touched, poetic way, dare I say. So I'm glad you guys came and experienced that. It was cool.
Loved it.
So let's like really distill down these principles of happiness and try. I want to get at the heart of like how we can, you know, think about this. You know, the average person can think about these things and think about how they can cultivate greater happiness in their own lives by making some lifestyle changes and decisions, you know, perhaps about the environment that they choose to surround, you know, the people in the actual physical environment in which they live. But, you know, even beyond that, I know that there are lifestyle, you know, things that can be tweaked to help promote these things, even though it's easier to put yourself in the environment that fosters that. But, you know, behavioral change, I think, is still, you know, an important part of it, is it not?
It's important if you can remember to do it. And I just essentially assume that people aren't going to remember to do it.
Yeah.
So if happiness is a cake recipe and
move to Boulder.
Yeah. Kind of that's where I was going. Marrying the right person, or being with the right person, getting the right work, being healthy, feeling like you're giving back. They're all ingredients. The most important ingredient in that cake recipe is where you live. So if you're unhappy, probably the most powerful thing you can do if you want to get happier is move to a happier place. And we know that statistically speaking. It has the biggest variance of any variable. And you might say, well, I can't do that. But the average American moves about 10 times in their adult life. So there's 10 opportunities. And if you can't live to a happier city, you can live to a happier neighborhood. And a happier neighborhood looks like this. It has a sidewalk out in front of your house. You live on a street where neighbors have about the same status level that you do. There are trees. There's easy access to parks. Where I live in Minneapolis, there's nobody lives more than 4 blocks away from a park. You're close to places to worship. You're close to being able to buy healthy food. Those are all elements more likely. If you live on water, you're about 5% more likely to be happy. It's ocean, river, lake. The happiest cities in America tend to be university towns, so that stacks the deck in your favor. When it comes to your house, you want to position your house so that it invites people in. The happiest Americans are socially interacting 5 to 6 hours a day. So you want to position yourself so you're inviting people in. So instead of a back deck, a front porch.
And those hours of socialization include home and profession, I presume.
Yeah, the key is that you're interacting with someone with whom you can have a meaningful conversation and you actually like them.
Right. So if your best friend works where you work.
Yeah. Or it can just be an okay friend, but it has to transcend talking smack, sports, or celebrity or something. You have to be able to say, I just had a big fight with my spouse and, does this ever happen to you type of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's the criteria. It'd be meaningful conversation. And it could be with your family too, or your neighbors. You want to make sure that your bedroom is set up so it's easy for you to get between 7.5 and 9 hours of sleep. So blackout windows, take the electronics out of that. The happiest people are sleeping over 7.5 hours a night on average. If you're sleeping 6 hours a night, you're probably 30% less happy than you are. So that's a really big one as well. TVs, there's room in our life for TVs and other screens. We did this huge research project with National Geographic, 100,000 respondents, and found that people are most happy when they're watching between a half hour and an hour of TV a day. So having a little bit of intellectual repose at the end of a hard day is okay. Mm-hmm. But if you're watching more than an hour a day, it's probably at the expense of doing more authentic forms of happiness, like physical activity or social interacting or volunteering.
Are there studies on internet use?
There's studies we also did one on social media. So like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. It's the same thing. It's about 45 minutes. Actually, people who are not on social media at all and people using it about 2 hours a day are about report the same level of happiness. The best is about an hour a day, which suggests that they're on it for a little entertainment, maybe to connect in the real world. Mm-hmm. But after 2 hours, you see this direct correspondence of dropping happiness with more social media use. And the least happy people are on it 8 hours a day.
Right.
So it's an approximation of the truth.
And is there a distinction? Obviously, community is important. Is there a breakdown or a distinction between those that are actively engaged in a faith-based community versus people that are just involved in their civic community?
Well, religiosity is measured, and it's measured by how often you show up to a church or temple or mosque. And as a rule, people who are religious are slightly happier, and you're especially happier if you live in a religious part of the country. So being religious in Denmark, for example, where only about 20% of people show up to church, being a churchgoer doesn't help your happiness much. But if you live in the Bible Belt, you're much more likely to be happy.
Well, you're involved in your community in a more fundamental way, I would imagine.
Volunteers are happier no matter where you go. The most counterintuitive thing in the world. If you get fired from your job, the best thing to do is go and volunteer. Take that focus off of your own woes and put it onto something else. Get out and network and get out and put your purpose to work elsewhere. So your point about community, yes. Getting involved with your community is definitely a secret to happiness.
And what about meditation?
A net positive. And so meditation is one of these liminal things. So here's the thing with meditation. I think you have to do it intensely enough for a while, either some meditation course or sticking with it for 10 weeks or doing a Vipassana, where you kind of rewire your brain. You're a meditator and you know how to do it and you can quickly do it. But if you're just going to meditate in front of, before yoga class for a while, it's not going to do you any good. And meditation, like so many other positive psychology interventions, for the most part, it only works as long as you're doing it. Right. So we tend to do it episodically. And if you do it every day, yes, there's good evidence, but people don't do it every day.
Most people don't. You're like the doctor who's like, yeah, I could tell them to eat better, but they're not going to do it. So I'm just giving them this pill and like sending them on their way.
But
you're telling them to move.
I mean, I'm like the doctor who says, tell them to eat better, but knowing they won't do it, I'll invite them over to my house and I'll teach them how to make a delicious Icarian stew or Sardinian minestrone, and they'll taste that, and I'll have them.
What about the distinction between movement? In the blue zones, it's not about, vigorous exercise and the way we think about it, treadmills and gyms and CrossFit and all that kind of stuff. It's just movement, is integrated into the daily lives in an almost unnoticeable way. And it's just continual and perpetual. But is there a distinction when you hone in on happiness between people that are, sort of active in the sense that they're walking and they're moving their bodies, or, maybe they work outdoors or what have you, versus, people that do kind of have a structured exercise regimen?
Well, people who are getting some sort of physical activity, 60 to 90 minutes a day, are happier or more likely to be happy than people who are slothful. But I'm not aware of any research that breaks down intense physical activity and increased happiness or decreased happiness.
And you touched on volunteerism, but I would imagine, happiness is very much tied to service, right? So people whose lives are focused on giving back, in my experience, seem to be, happier people. And I know that I'm happier and more fulfilled and feeling more purposeful when I'm in the spirit of giving, even if that giving is really in the context of my professional life. That kind of, ethos, for me translates into a higher happiness quotient. So are there studies on that, or how does that break down?
The best thing I've ever heard along those lines comes from a Norwegian Buddhist monk who lives in Minnesota, who points out that we all have 99 problems. We're getting a wrinkle, we have an ache, our roof is leaking, we have a dent in our car, whatever it is. And we can put all of our effort into fixing those top problems and maybe resolve the top 10 of them. But by the time we get those top 10 off the list, there's 10 new ones at the bottom. So it's accepting that we're always going to have 99 problems and putting our focus elsewhere, usually on somebody else's problems or helping somebody else off. And in so doing that, those 99 problems diminish in size and they become less urgent and they become less salient in our everyday life. So yes, volunteering, helping others is a surefire way of making yourself happier.
Yeah, it's a core precept of recovery sobriety, like 12-step. Like when you're not having a good day, it's like this is what you're told, like pick up the phone and call somebody who's having a worse day.
I like
talking
that.
Through it, you know what I mean? And then suddenly your day doesn't seem so bad. It's almost like selfish selflessness, you know what I mean? Like when you're feeling terrible and you want to focus on yourself and your world and your huge problems. If you can just get outside of yourself and invest yourself in somebody else's issue, your problems seem to diminish. And also the solution tends to percolate up and seems more manageable and accessible. What was the thing that in the course of doing this research and studying these communities that was most surprising to you or counterintuitive, or what you didn't expect? Or it just play out the way you thought it would?
Well, that Singapore would be so happy. I fully expected to, because Singapore is famous for caning people, and if you have more than 14 grams of drugs, they hang you. And thinking that this is all propaganda here, and getting there and find out, yes, that actually there's a form of happiness where when the path to success is neatly laid out for you, and you live in this secure area where it's easy to live out your values, it can indeed produce happiness. And then to go to the other side of the planet with a diametrically opposed way of doing things. The Danes are completely free. The laws are very lax, and a completely different way of doing things. And that's produced the happiest, in a different way, happiest. So the path up the mountain of happiness, they take different faces, so to speak, but the summit looks pretty much the same no matter what route you took.
Are you going to now set up a Blue Zones happiness program that you're going to take city to city, or are you going to incorporate some of these principles into what you're already doing?
It's taken me a decade. I work with ShareCare, and we have 200 employees right now, and I'm not about to subset that. We are developing a policy bundle. So laws and codes and policies that municipal governments can adopt that make it more likely that their city will be happy. So again, we don't tell cities what to do. We show them the policies, and we help them pick what's right for them, and then we help them get it passed. So some things that'll make your city more likely to be happy. Water quality. There's a huge correlation between water quality. Noise, as we talked about before, walkability, bikeability, programs that help the depressed and people who are anxious. There are city programs that can do that. So just making it clear of what cities can do that will really favor happiness. So we'll just incorporate it into our current Blue Zones projects.
If you were able to petition Congress, or let's say you held some high-ranking appointed position in the White House, what policies on the federal level would you like to see changed that could foster, these ideas that you're working on at the municipal level? What has to change at the federal government, at the highest level? What's fixable? I'm not talking about we're not going to turn into Singapore, but what can we work on?
Okay, so number one, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So right now we measure the economy. We should be using a gross national happiness index to measure. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, a politician's job is to make us happy, to the greatest amount of well-being rather than. So that should be the North Star for all policy and how we're measuring our presidents and Congress and the Senate. Are they making us happier? Number two, Cameron's government in Great Britain, he formed a team, 50 people, whose job it was to develop policies most likely to increase happiness. So it has to start with an evidence base. So we should have a sort of a squad within the federal government that focuses on well-being. And you can't ramrod things through Congress. It requires a conversation and a consensus, and but we have to know what to do, and we have to be able to measure it. And those are the first two steps, and be funding it.
Mm-hmm. What changes have you made as a result in your own life? I mean, you're living in Santa Barbara. You were living in Minnesota. Prior to that, already, very Blue Zones friendly regions, locations. But did this work kind of, inform other changes that you're thinking about making, or have made, or need to make? Where's where can you find greater happiness in your own experience, even after doing all of this stuff?
Yes.
The journey's always continuing.
Right. So you're way more likely to be happy if you're in a committed relationship. So I'm with the lovely and cruciferous Kathy Freston.
She is lovely indeed.
And she is vegan, so I eat a lot more vegetables. It turns out that people who are eating 7 servings of vegetables a day are happier. I know the importance of sleep, so I'm not penny wise and pound foolish when it comes to my time. I get my 8 hours of sleep no matter what. I usually don't use an alarm. I know that I'm more likely to be happy if I'm healthy, so it is almost impossible to get me to spend a day without getting some form of physical activity, I like to do. I love people, and I make time for my friends. I try to socialize 6 or 7 hours. I take a nap.
You take a nap every day?
Pretty much.
Do you?
I'm good at power nap.
Wow. What time do you wake up in the morning?
I wake up after 8 hours. So if I went deep, last night I went to bed at midnight. I woke up at 8.
Right.
I took a little nap before I came over here, actually.
That's good, man.
So yeah, it makes a big difference. Drinking a little bit is fine for happiness. Drinking a lot is probably against it. So I kind of cut off at 2 or 3 drinks.
Unless you're me. It's not good. One's not good, man.
Yeah, I'm not even going to go there with you, Rich, although I'd like to.
It's a different story. That's a different podcast.
Yes.
And kite sailing, that's going to be the new thing?
Yeah, I'm really passionate about that. It's knowing your passions and trying them. So I live up in Santa Barbara that has this the ideal kite sailing conditions in the country. So
I've seen those guys up there doing that, but I don't know that I don't know anybody who's done it.
Well, you'll know me.
I'm going to know you.
3 months.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can rope
We'll do
me
a field
into
trip.
I think, one of the things that has been inspiring to me about you and your example is that you've accomplished a lot. Like you've created these, incredible works through the books that you've written and the talks that you've given and the advocacy that you do and how you've kind of institutionalized it for the benefit of these cities. That kind of social impact is what I aspire to, and you've been a great mentor and a friend, and I've learned a lot by getting to know you and by just learning from your experience. But you're not a workaholic. A lot of people who are creating books like you, I mean, these are deep dives. Like this is deep work. These take years and years to put together. And most people that are involved in that kind of work, like they live hermetically and they're shut-ins, and because the amount of focus and intention that's required to produce them is so intense, right? But you've been able to live these principles of the blue zones and create this life for yourself in which you're able to be as productive as you are and still maintain this extraordinary quality of life. And that's like a magic trick to me when I look at it.
Well, in these blue zone areas, I walk the talk. I learn from them. But I do when it comes to work, I tend to be like a crack addict. I'm on it for 8 hours a day. After take my nap, eat my lunch, etc., get my workout. But you have to put a gun to my head to get me to work after 5 o'clock usually. So there's no upside to being more fanatic. I could have maybe written this book quicker, but I would have had less fun doing it. So, I mean, thanks for pointing that out, but it's true. I put a deep emphasis in consciousness and for the most part, enjoying my days with the right balance of doing something productive that will yield that life satisfaction, that pride that I think is important.
Yeah. And it's cool that your passion for adventure. You used to do these crazy expeditions, these bicycle. We talked about it the first time that we sat down together. That the work that you do in these books seems to serve that wanderlust or that desire to continue adventuring.
Well, I've been with National Geographic now for almost 20 years, and Peter Miller, my great editor, pointed out a long time ago that these geographic firsts are kind of passé right now. That if you want to be an explorer in this day and age, you need to add to the body of knowledge, and you need to educate or illuminate the human experience. And the bike rides were great experience. I think everybody graduating from a college and university in this country, even a high school, should be required to live abroad for 6 months or a year. You learn more during those times than any place else. And I was able to do that in almost overdrive with 8 years of these, seeing the world from my bicycle. And you develop empathy. You develop a certain amount of wisdom. After all, wisdom is knowledge plus experience. And maybe I didn't get the most knowledge in the world doing those, but I got a ton of experience. So that kind of adds to the wisdom. And it gives you a lot of quiet time to think. I'm sure you probably get your best thinking done when you're, doing a marathon across the Swedish archipelago.
I don't know how much thinking I was doing then. I was thinking about when it was going to be over, but in general, like on a daily basis. Yeah.
But I'll bet you find your running very
of course
meditative, and you probably get a lot of good ideas doing that. Yeah. And so the expeditions leading up to what I'm doing now was part of that.
David just rode his bike across. David, who's filming over here, he just rode his bike across Australia. Not that long
kidding
ago.
me? I knew I loved him, and not just because he's from Malta, and he's got a lot of hair.
He has excellent hair.
He does.
But then maturing those adventures to then mine the human spirit and extract from it ideas that can be beneficial to others. Like that's the National Geographic mission, right?
More and more it is.
Yeah.
Yes, they're finding that's the only way they can be relevant. They can't keep covering summits of Everest or making it to the North Pole, which is going to disappear in a few years anyway.
Speaking of which, Blue Zones of Happiness is a cover story for Nat Geo. Is that the October issue? It's
the November issue coming out mid-October.
Yeah, that's exciting, man.
I'm very psyched.
With David's photographs.
Well, actually, it's Corey Richards' photographs, different photographer. But there was actually 2 photographers working on it. It took 14 months to cover and shoot that story. And the photographers, super hard workers, they made at least 2 trips to each of these Blue Zones of Happiness to cover it right. And
what's the difference between the book and what's going to be in the piece?
So the piece just focuses on the happiest places. And the book is more about how to take what we learned in these places and put it to work in your life. It offers a blueprint for changing your personal environment, 6 different facets of your personal environment, to make it more likely you'll be happy. And then it marshals in the science so we know what really works for happiness and what doesn't.
It's exciting, man. October 3rd it comes out, and you're going to be doing like a residency on the Today Show. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. 4 days on the Today Show. It probably already have passed, but it's October 9th, 10th, 11th.
No, I'll put this up before then. And is that going to be you in studio at the Today Show with filmed stuff that took place in these communities, or how's that going to go? It's
no, I've traveled to all of the Blue Zones areas with the Today Show.
I see. And so the stuff's in the can already.
Yes, but then I'm going to New York to be on set.
To be there, right.
Yeah,
right,
marshaled in. But no, I work with Cynthia McFadden there, and a very gifted producer named Jake Whitman, and we've done a number of stories with the Blue Zones of Longevity, and now we're doing Happiness together, and it's a great little team to work with.
It's going to be amazing, man. Are you excited? Do you like the publicity marketing side of all this kind of stuff, being the forward-facing
Not really. I can do it.
Yeah.
I can do it, but no. I'm from the Midwest, and the tall tree gets chopped off in the Midwest. But as an author, you have to sing for your supper, or you don't eat. Yeah. I enjoy talking with you. This is probably the most fun I'll have, actually.
Dan's the most charming man on the planet.
I'm a reporter. I just report the facts.
October 3rd. So it's October 9th and then 4 days on that week, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's cool, man. And what's beyond that? What's next? What's getting you excited?
Well, I'll gestate for a while. I want to focus on the art of life for a while, and I've spent a lot of time developing this happiness idea and the Blue Zones idea, and now I want to create a new avocation and focus on the art of life and how do you optimize this experience we're all given? In-Q said this great story that a guy gets to heaven, and he says, well, okay, what do we do now when we're up here? And God said, you were just in heaven, and you screwed it up. This life I think if you really think about it and try, there's so much more to be made of our experiences here. And my research shapes the decisions I make, but now I need to customize that general knowledge into a personal prescriptive. So,
well, I think you deserve it, man.
Yeah, at least for a month.
Yeah. Good talking to you.
Likewise, Rich.
Yeah, man. We did it.
This is
How do you feel?
Oh my God, I love
Anything else you want to say?
No, I will say, when I first met you and I did this podcast, it was just fun rapping with you, but I speak all over the country and I cannot tell you how, I've done TED Talks and Oprah. More people come up to me and say, "Oh, I heard you on the Rich Roll podcast." And it's like an instant membership into the club of cool. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thanks, man. You know all the right things to say to butter me up, man. I'm telling you.
Just channeling.
All right. Super fun, man. And I look forward to doing more of these with you. In the meantime, everybody pick up The Blue Zones of Happiness. I'm sure you're going to be seeing a lot of this book. It's going to be in our atmosphere everywhere you look. You can catch Dan on the Today Show on those appointed dates. And you can find him on the internet at, is it at Dan Buettner or at Blue Zones?
At Blue Zones.
At Blue Zones on Twitter, right? And you're on Instagram as well?
At Blue Zones and BlueZones.com.
BlueZones.com for all your Blue Zones
needs.
Edification and entertainment, man. All right. Awesome, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Peace and plants. Namaste.